And welcome back. I hope you enjoyed the networking, those of you who participated. What we're going to do is to kick off our final session, we're going to do a polling question. And the polling question that Ian's bringing up on the screen now is, how important would globally consistent, comparable and reliable sustainability disclosures be for you? And your options are business critical, very important, quite important, or not important. So please let us know what you think. And the answers are coming in, and currently business critical is out front with very important coming second. So I guess that's looking good. We'll leave the polls open for another couple of minutes so you can add in any additional answers, and you can see the results on screen. What I'm going to do next is introduce our moderator and speaker for the next session. Our speaker is going to be Kevin Dancey, CEO of the International Federation of Accountants based in New York. And interviewing Kevin is going to be Brian Keegan, Director of Public Affairs with Chartered Accountants Ireland based in Dublin. Brian, I'm passing to you.
Thanks very much indeed, David. And hi, Kevin. Hi, everybody. It's great to be here this afternoon.
Hey, Brian.
This was billed as a fireside chat, but I think the only heat we're going to get is maybe the heat off the server farms as we're all broadcasting virtually. So forgive us if we have to riff a little bit on the notion of a fireside chat. But for those who don't know Kevin, he's possibly one of the most distinguished characters in the entire profession. He's the Chief Executive of the International Federation of Accountants, almost 200 accountancy bodies, over 100 countries represented in that particular forum. He's a former senior partner in PwC in Canada, former senior official in the Canadian Ministry of Finance, and also to a former president and CEO of the Canadian Institute of Chartered Accountants, where he spearheaded a fundamental reform of the profession in that country. So it's great to have you on board, Kevin. And particularly,
good to be here, Brian. Sorry?
Particularly nice, given that, what's your personal interest, Kevin, in all this sustainability stuff?
Well, I guess in terms of my personal interest, I guess, it's pretty hard to say you're not interested in sustainability these days when you look at the state of the world. It's clearly been an issue that's been top of mind for within our profession by many leaders over actually many decades, in the sense this is not a new topic. And I think if I could do my small bit in terms of, moving the yardsticks forward, I think that's enough of, enough to kind of keep me going. But just, when I put my hat on as CEO of IFak, it's just such a huge opportunity for the profession. I think of what Mervyn King said a few years ago, only accountants can save the world. And I think that is very, very true in terms of, what the role accountants can play. And I think, what makes me really excited probably boils down to two or three things. One, like I said, it's such a huge opportunity. The value proposition that is there, the demand for this service is there. The demand is from investors. Investors need this information. They want this information. Regulators want this information. They're going to continue to ask for and demand this information. So the demand is there. And when you think about this profession, really since Sarbanes-Oxley, we've been in a bit of a compliance trap in terms of certain aspects of our business. When you think of the audit, how many audit partners do you talk to these days who feel like it's a compliance activity that they're doing? So this is a real opportunity to provide a value-added service to our clients and to all these stakeholders out there. I think that's a very important point. Now, when you think of the role that professional accountants play in this, we're all over this ecosystem, right? If you're a professional accountant in business, you're going to be engaged in, do we have the right systems to collect this data? Are we collecting the right data?
Yep.
Are we supporting the decision makers in the business the right way with the information they need? If you're a practitioner, there's opportunities in terms of giving services to clients in terms of how they adapt to this new world, right? There's going to be services that you can give around assurance in terms of this new information, in terms of how the information is reported out. Mm-hmm. If you're a professional accountant who's in the governance area now, maybe the chair of an audit committee, it's going to be a key responsibility to meet that demand and that requirement going forward. And we have, professional accountants who are involved in the investor community who are demanding this. So we're all over this ecosystem. Yeah. So you have a situation where there's a huge demand for this information. We as a profession play all over this ecosystem. So it's a huge opportunity for us. And probably the last thing that would make me particularly excited is when you think of this profession, you really got to think about the future and where the future accountant is going to come from. And in terms of the attractiveness of our profession, this, I believe, focusing on sustainability in terms of the new kids who might be interested in our profession really gives them a sense of that they can look at our profession and see a sense of purpose. And that's going to be very attractive to them. And I think that will help us attract the best and brightest to this profession going forward. So for a whole variety of reasons, I just think this is just such a huge opportunity for our profession going forward.
Yeah, and those are particularly compelling reasons. And you mentioned the role of the accountant as almost the enforcer of compliance, and that's something I'd like to come back to maybe later on in the conversation. But given that you're seeing the whole sustainability agenda as so fundamental to the role of the profession going forward, maybe you'd like to expand just a little bit on what IFak is doing, has done to date, and how it's sort of driving the direction the profession needs to take as we try and meet the sustainability challenge.
Right. We've really tried to play on the thought leadership side of the sustainability file for really the last year. Obviously, as IFak, we're not going to be creating the reporting standards going forward for this new information. But last September, sorry?
Should we be?
No, I don't think so. I'll come back to that point.
Fun.
Because you're going to ask me a question with the IFRS Foundation, and we're going to be behind that. So
cool.
Let me just say, I must say the screen's a bit funny. I can see one screen where I'm live and another screen where I'm tape delayed. So I don't know what screen people are seeing. The live one looks good. The tape delayed one looks a bit awkward, but I'll leave that here.
You're good to me if that helps, Kevin. It's perfectly in sync. Good. So we'll go with that.
Yeah. Anyway, the last September, we came out with a roadmap in terms of what we should think, what we thought should happen in this area, really calling on the IFRS Foundation to move into this area and create a new sustainability standards board alongside the ISB. And we'll get back to that, I know, in a later topic. And I think that, kind of one pager we put out was very well received by a number of stakeholders. And indeed, we liaised with a lot of stakeholders prior to putting that out. All the other kind of global, standard setters and framework setters in the sustainability space. We liaised with IOSCO, the global securities regulators. We even liaised with the IFRS, World Economic Forum, etc. So we were on pretty good ground when we put that roadmap out last September. Probably. And we've continued to be engaged. The IFRS Foundation put out their consultation paper last fall, and we put a submission to that along with a host of other contributors. I think one of the most significant things we've put out in the last month or so is we put out a schematic on what we call a building blocks approach to this issue going forward. So, just to step back for a second, when you think about non-financial reporting and sustainability reporting, you have an area where there are many, many stakeholders. There are many demands for information, and it's all over the map, right? In terms of what people want. It could be investors, or it could be other NGOs or NPOs, or it could be governments in terms of their public policy initiatives, in terms of what a particular jurisdiction wants to see. If you're going to operate in my country, this is what you're going to have to tell us about what you're doing, right? And so to think that's all going to come together in some nice, neat global package, I think is pretty naive. And so we've kind of split it down into what we call two building blocks, which is, I think, about as simple as we could get. So the first building block is what we call the outside-in impacts. They're the impacts that are out there on an entity in terms of its enterprise value, its long-term performance. So this level of reporting is really what investors are after, because they want to know, how's the company going to do in terms of its long-term performance. and the financial reporting is not enough. They need more. So this building block one, it's the outside in impacts. It's the impacts out there of any particular factor that's going to affect the long-term performance of the entity. It's what investors want. It's what global capital markets want. It's what IOSCO wants. So it's what the global regulators want. And that information, that needs to be global. Mm-hmm. And if you look at what IOSCO has put out, they're talking about a baseline of, corporate reporting that deals with those particular factors, the ones that affect the enterprise value creation of the entity. Now, what building block two is kind of the reverse. It's what we call the inside out impacts. They're the impacts that the company may have on the economy, the environment, the people, sure, all kinds of impacts that company may have, but none of those impacts have a boomerang effect back on the performance of the entity. Yeah. At least not now. Now, in time, sure, they may, but they don't right now. Now, those things are what we call building block two. We think a lot of those will be jurisdiction specific, driven by public policy issues. And just as an example, pick any particular people or any particular issue, I should say, around employees or performance in terms of diversity targets or human rights issues and all this kind of stuff. It's pretty naive to me to think you will get the same public policy demands in Europe, yep, as you get in North America or South America or Asia or China. That's just naive to think that that's all going to be global. So these are jurisdiction specific requirements, I would say, that are going to be there, which will be top ups at the jurisdiction level. And so that's the building block one and building block two in kind of a nutshell. Now, they're not static because, things could be in a building block two now, but maybe in a building block one down the road. And in the schematic we put out a month or so ago, we included an example of greenhouse gas emissions. If you look at greenhouse gas emissions, if you go back a number of years, the issue came on the radar. What's the impact that the company has on the environment in terms of greenhouse gas emissions? That was the inside out impact. That's a building block two. At that point in time, it did not have a boomerang effect back on the performance or the long-term, value creation of the entity. As time marched on, all of a sudden said, oh, wow, this may have reputational issues, it may have issues in terms of stranded assets. That is going to be relevant as an investor in terms of looking at the long-term performance of the entity. And indeed, it may even go beyond the non-financial reporting requirements into the financial reporting requirements in terms of the financial statements. So, this issue is not static, and things can move from, one level to the next. But we do believe this building block one, building block two is the way to reconcile what needs to happen at the global level versus what, just in terms of the reality of the world, will happen at the jurisdiction level. Sure. And what I would say is that if we don't get to that kind of approach, if we don't get a baseline of global information that works for investors and global capital markets, we will have failed. Because that's a world of regulatory fragmentation. It's a world of increased costs. And frankly, it's not meeting the demand of global investors, global capital markets, or the global regulators. So it's really incumbent upon us to get that building block one right. And this will be a natural lead in to your next question around the IFRS Foundation.
Well, yeah, I know. I think that's absolutely right, because I think on this side of the pond, if you're looking at the IFak schematic on the two building blocks, you realize two things. First of all, it's very pragmatic. You're not trying to boil the ocean at once. And if we listen to any of the speakers in the earlier sessions, the demand for concrete, reliable information is absolutely clear. But secondly, it sort of resonates with this European concept, of double materiality. That you've got the materiality of what actually happens to the balance sheet of the entity, and you've got the materiality of what actually happens within the broader environment. So I think those two chime. So if you'll bear with me then, or if the audience will bear with me for a moment, you'd be forgiven for thinking that the G7 talked about nothing except tax there 10 days ago with the talk about global minimum rates and shifting of tax take to markets and all the rest. But really, for me, I think that the issue which is going to resonate long after the tax is their statement on sustainability and the emphasis on the need to green the global financial system. It seemed to me, Kevin, that they voted very much in favour of the IFRS Foundation, the International Financial Reporting Standards Foundation, as I suppose, the main carrier of the formulation of accounting standards. Would you concur with that approach?
I think I think, when I looked at the statement they put out, I think there were a lot of great things in it. There were a lot of great quotes in it. They talked about a baseline of global reporting standards. They welcomed the work of the IFRS. And what I was particularly happy to see is that they encouraged the IFRS to move with speed. So I really think, at least as it relates to building block one, putting that in the hands of the IFRS Foundation is the way to go. And I can elaborate that on the various reasons. Do you want me to go down in terms of a number of reasons why, in terms of my logic? Would that be good?
I think quickly for anybody who's listening who's not particularly familiar with the work of the IFRS Foundation, that would be really helpful.
Sure. Like I think, well, first of all, I think, as I said, we need a global approach for that building block one, or that baseline of information. Otherwise, it's going to lead to regulatory fragmentation and increased costs. And, the IFRS Foundation is there. It is global. It has connectivity with a number of jurisdictions and a number of regulatory organizations around the world, 140 plus. Second, you can't think of this sustainability reporting and the sustainability information that's required independent or separate from the financial reporting. That's they are integrated together. Now, in many companies today, when they do reporting, they have their financial statements, their financial report, and then they have maybe a sustainability report. They're not necessarily integrated within the organization. Mm-hmm. Within a company, they need to become integrated going forward. And I think having a new sustainability standards board alongside the ISB allows for that connectivity and integration. I think speed is very important. You mentioned Europe. Europe is marching along, and kudos to them for what they've been able to accomplish and where they're going. But if Europe's the only one marching along and others march along out of step, we're going to have different jurisdictional approaches and regulatory fragmentation. The only body that I see out there that can hopefully move with speed, which is something they necessarily haven't done in the past, is move with speed, right? The IFRS Foundation is not known to be a speedy vehicle when you look at the length of time with how long did it take the leasing standard to come out, as an example. But I think it's the only global body that's already set up that has legitimacy in terms of the backing of public authorities like IOSCO, that has the possibility of moving with speed to get that baseline of global information in terms of building block one, at least as it relates to the climate prototype, which is already out there. It needs to be coalesced into a standard. So I think they can move with speed. Obviously, I like the IFRS Foundation because they're adopting the building block approach, which is what IFak agrees with and what IFAK's been pushing for quite a while. And I think it's the only way of trying to reconcile what Europe wants to do and what the IFRS Foundation wants to do, what IOSCO wants to do, and maybe what the US wants to do. I'm not sure what the US wants to do yet, but it looks like they're going to do something. So a lot of moving players here. Plus, I think in terms of if we can get a global framework for reporting on that block one sustainability information out of the IFRS Foundation, that's a necessary precondition to getting the assurance right. If you're going to think about, well, how do you do assurance on this stuff, and what assurance do you need? You need limited assurance, reasonable assurance, yada yada yada. What do you do? Everything. There are certain standards out there right now with ISO 3000, and IAASB has put out some guidance. But I think everybody is waiting a little bit until we say, okay, now what is the true global reporting framework and standards on this stuff? And then you can make sure that your assurance ties to what that reporting framework is. And again, that's why I would say we're backing the IFRS Foundation horse to hopefully get us to that position so we can do our part in terms of IFAK. You asked what IFAK should be doing in the terms. I think there's a real spot for us in terms of the assurance standards, in terms of supporting that, the assurance guidance in terms of what professional accountants should be doing around that. So for a whole bunch of reasons, I think the IFRS Foundation is the game in town, and I'm encouraged with the speed that it's been working with in the last 6 months. I'm encouraged they're out consulting on their constitution review right now. And I would encourage them and hope that they would have that they would decide to set up a sustainability standards board, and that they'd have a chair and vice chair in place before COP26 next fall, and that they seize that climate prototype to really get that into the context of what a new reporting standard should look like.
Yeah, very good. You know, they do have that sort of tentative deadline's not the right word for it, but certainly target date of September. But it's not exactly as if they'll be starting with a completely blank slate either. I mean, there have been groups of standard setters, standard compilers out there for several years, actually putting together some thinking. What's the future of some of the existing work that's already been done? Will the IFRS Foundation be able to accommodate? Will be able to incorporate some of the thinking that's already been put in place by the likes of SASB and some of the others? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, look, I think there's a lot of good work that's been done. What we have strongly encouraged the IFRS Foundation to do is to leverage the work of others. I think IOSCO has done that as well. I think, most people are saying to the IFRS Foundation, you don't have to recreate this from the ground up. You can leverage a lot of the work of others. And, for example, if I look at SASB, which is a set of industry-specific reporting standards in the Integrated Reporting Council. Sorry about that. This is ringing. I'll have to just give me a second to get rid of this. There we go. I should have unplugged it before this. Sorry about that. But if you if you look at the Integrated Reporting Council and their kind of framework around integrated reporting, and the fact that the IRC and SASB have come together in the Value Reporting Foundation, I view that as a stepping stone that eventually that should really be folded into the IFRS Foundation. I don't see a world, down the road where all of these currently existing standard setters or framework setters continue to exist as separate entities, because I think that's confusing. And frankly, they're all chasing the same funding. That's and, right. And I support the IFSB and ISBA and the IFSASB board. So I know all about the challenges in terms of trying to wrestle up funding for standard setting in the global world these days. And it's not easy. So I think if we can get some good consolidation or rationalization of these entities around the IFRS Foundation. I think the IFRS Foundation has to meet some of these organizations halfway too. It can't be like the IFRS saying, well, yeah, you've done this stuff. Maybe we'll look at it, maybe we won't. No, they've done a lot of good work. And the fact that they exist is the opportunity for the IFRS Foundation to leverage their work and move with speed. Because moving with speed is so important. If the IFRS Foundation does not move with speed, we're going to fail as well.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, when I was looking back at the history of how all these things happen, apparently the G7 issued a communique back in 1998, encouraging the IFRS Foundation to start developing standards, and 5 years later they came out with the first one. So I don't think we have that luxury, but neither do we have the luxury of not doing anything, because as somebody in industry said to me quite recently, the problem isn't so much that there are no standards; it is that there are too many of them, and that they're all over the place. We just really need to try and pin that down a little bit. But of course, it's all very well having standards, and there's clearly an appetite again, by reference to the earlier speakers today. But implementing standards comes at a cost. You mentioned that at the top of our discussion, the very positive things for accountants and for the profession and how it might attract people in. But for financial controllers, for decision makers in industry, they're going to look at the implementation of these standards and they're going to have a sharp intake of breath, I think, if only on the basis of the limited experience we have here in Europe from compliance with the non-financial reporting directive.
True. I don't discount that. I actually think there's some fear and trepidation around the profession on that point. as well. For example, if you look back to the implementation of Sarbanes-Oxley in the United States, was a heavy cost exercise, and I think there are a number of practitioners within the U.S. profession who will remember that was a bit of a painful event at times in terms of those discussions with clients. Right. I think what I'd like to think is different this time, even compared, yes, compared to Sarbanes-Oxley, and maybe yes, compared to other things as well, is that the demand this time seems very, very high. The demand is high from investors. And if you're in business and you want to attract capital, you have to meet the demands of investors. So this is not an option, all right? So you have the demands of investors. I think you also have the demands of regulators. And I'm talking not just about securities regulators, it could be governmental requirements. Yep. In terms of, you mentioned Europe, in terms of if you want to operate in my jurisdiction, this is what you got to do, right? It's just the cost of doing business. So you have the cost of doing business aspect, you got to meet the demand of investors. I also think, again, with the right use of technology, this is hopefully a great opportunity to access data and use it the right way, and quality data. Like, if this whole area has been plagued by one thing, it's been plagued by a number of things probably over the years, but arguably it's also been plagued by bad data. Okay. And bad data can lead to bad reporting. And so I think there's an opportunity through a lot of research and effort in terms of using technology and the right systems to extract the right data, whether it's structured or unstructured data, and accumulate that data in the right way so it can be used for either building block 1 or building block 2. Yep. So you can extract it once. So I think it's a huge opportunity for our profession in terms of the systems area to help there, and which will hopefully provide the controllers and the CFOs of a business with better information, better data to manage their business, better information to support the decision makers in the business. And hopefully that will help in terms of, at least you think logically, that should help in terms of the long run sustainability of the entity. So from a business perspective and risk mitigation perspective, I think you could argue, it is the right thing to do. But there's going to be costs, and obviously there's a cost benefit issue in here. And it'll be an issue that will obviously get put into the mix. Obviously, I think what's going to have to be put into the mix is, does it apply just to listed entities? What about small and medium-sized enterprises, right? How do they fit into this? Are they going to have to deal with all this too, right? So my own sense on that is that over time, I think this type of reporting, if it's good for listed entities or pies, is probably good for SMEs too, but it has to be proportionate. So think of something like IFRS for SMEs. Think about sustainability standards for SMEs. Something like that, perhaps going forward, will have to be on the radar. And at least initially, I would think for the SME sector, it would be voluntary compliance as opposed to mandatory. As opposed, for the little listed entities and the pies, I think this is going to end up being mandatory.
Sure, but you'd have to expect that somewhere along the supply chain line, if you've got a listed entity, public interest entity, needing to report coherently, they have to have some kind of a sense of what their suppliers, who might be a much smaller entity, are doing. So it may well ripple down, and it may actually confer competitive advantage for those smaller entities to actually adopt earlier. We'd hope. So you're absolutely right about the importance of the systems and the old saying, garbage in, garbage out. We've got to collect the right information. But something we touched on earlier on, how do we then ensure the information? And again, something that keeps coming up in all the debates and discussions. There's plenty of businesses out there, Kevin, as we know, producing information on their green credentials. But how sure can we be of any of it? Maybe your thoughts on how the assurance platform is gonna pan out.
Yeah, and I think it's going to be a bit of a journey for us. I'll just do a little bit of a shout out for our report we're going to be issuing on Monday, which is a study we've done in conjunction with AICPA, SEMA, and Audit Analytics, where we've looked at the top 20 jurisdictions around the world, the G20 plus Singapore and Hong Kong, and we've looked at the top listed entities in those jurisdictions. I think we looked at the top 100 entities in the top 6 jurisdictions, in the top 50 and all the others. So about 1,400 companies, really to get a benchmark in terms of, is there a sustainability report? If there is assurance done on it? If assurance is done on it, what type of assurance was done on it? If assurance was done on it, who did that assurance, right? And what it will show is all over the map, right? In terms of, if I looked at Europe, for example, if I looked at France, a lot of assurance on sustainability reports, almost all done by the Big Four. If I looked at certain jurisdictions in Asia, yeah, it could be a fair amount of assurance, not a lot by the accountancy profession, right? So it's all over the map. And in terms of what standard they're using, some are using ISO 3000. Some say they're using, well, it's kind of based on ISO 3000 or in relation to ISO 3000, or some are using the UN SDGs, which aren't even a standard, but that's what they say they're using, right? Or something else. So there's no consistency there. So this is a benchmark. We're going to be holding roundtables over the summer in various jurisdictions and regions around the world to tease out this information, because we think this is an important one going forward. I really think this is a really significant opportunity for the profession going forward. We're not going to have a monopoly in this space, but I think it is ours to win or lose. I think we're probably better positioned than any other profession to win in this space. Because if you're doing the financial audit, it makes sense to do this, because if they're integrated together, it makes sense. Plus, not only do we have the skill sets in terms of doing assurance, but we have that ethical foundation, which I think is going to be very important in this area going forward. People say, well, maybe professional accountants don't have the skills and competencies to report in this area. Frankly, I think we have the accountancy profession has been dealing with complex reporting issues for years. This is just another one. Now, in this one, I would say is that what we're lacking, perhaps, is the subject matter expertise in some of the areas. And so how do we make sure that we get that, or can we rely on that and demonstrate how we rely on it, et cetera? And we're doing some work around that space as well. So you'll probably hear more from us come the fall on that area as well. But I think the accountancy profession is well positioned to succeed in this assurance area. But like I said, there's going to be others, and we will have to demonstrate the value that we can bring to the table, and why companies and boards of directors and audit committees should hire our profession as opposed to the other guys.
Well, we're just going to have to fight our corner, and we're also going to have to be very mindful of the time. So what I'm going to have to do there, Kevin, is to thank you very much indeed for sharing your thoughts. I hope the audience got a real sense of the kind of progress that's been made, of the kind of opportunities that are there for the profession. I'd strongly commend anybody to take a look at the IFak.org website, see the building blocks schematic that Kevin described for us. Also to take a look at some of the consultation work. There's an excellent document gone to the US Securities and Exchange Commission, for example, in recent days, which really crystallizes so many of the issues for the profession as we deal with sustainability reporting and assurance on those kind of figures. So on your behalf, it's just for me to thank Kevin for his time, his insight and his interest. Great talking to you, Kevin. My name is Brian Keegan of Chartered Accountants Ireland. I'm going to hand you back now to David Powell. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you both. And if we can put the final polling question up, what we can do next is see the result of our last poll. So polling question number 6. Is going to be re-asking our last polling question to see if we have any changes. And so that is, how important would globally consistent, comparable and reliable sustainability disclosures be for you? Is that business critical, very important, quite important, or not important? So please take a moment to answer that. And as those results are coming in, I'd like to thank our presenters, our sponsors, our attendees, and Chartered Accountants Ireland, especially their chapters in Toronto and London. Before you exit, please fill in the feedback survey that's available on screen. And networking will still be open for the next 30 minutes. And don't forget our next mini conference on July the 29th, the Future Fit Chartered Accountant, in partnership with the South African Institute of Chartered Accountants. I look forward to you joining us then. Meantime, let's look at our poll. And yeah, it looks like business critical is the key item, and it looks like it has increased slightly on what we had at the start. So I thank you for that, and I wish you well. I'm closing the session now. Please stay on for the networking and join us again next time. Thank you.